A black girl shares her sandwich with a homeless stranger. The next day, cops appear at her doorstep, leaving her stunned. Why are they looking for this man? And how does her act of kindness lead to such unexpected consequences? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Mary was enjoying a picnic with her mother, Brenda, visiting a scenic park where they could enjoy some time in solitude. With her pale skin and blonde hair, Brenda pulled into a neat bun and watched her 15-year-old girl with a protective gaze. Despite their obvious physical differences, the bond between them was clear. Brenda had raised Mary with love, even though she sometimes felt out of place in the world they navigated together. "Mary, don't go too far," Brenda called from the picnic blanket spread beneath a large oak tree. "I won't, Mom!" Mary shouted back, her voice filled with excitement. As she walked across the park, something caught her eye. A black man sat on a nearby bench, his clothes tattered and dirty. He looked sad and alone. Mary slowed her spinning and studied the man from afar. His beard was scruffy and his hair was messy, but what struck her most were his eyes. The man seemed like he would burst out crying at just about any moment now. Curiosity bubbled up inside her. Who was this man? Why did he look so sad? Mary glanced back at her mom, who was busy reading a book. She knew she shouldn't talk to strangers, but something about this man made her want to know more. Taking a deep breath, Mary gathered her courage and walked towards the bench. As she got closer, she noticed the man had a small bag next to him. It looked old and worn, just like his clothes. "Hi," Mary said softly when she reached the bench. The man looked up, surprised. A gentle smile spread across his face. "Hello there, young lady," he replied, his voice kind but rough. Mary fidgeted with the hem of her shirt. "I'm Mary. What's your name?" "I'm Jake," he answered, his eyes crinkling at the corners as he smiled wider. Mary pointed to the empty spot next to him. "Can I sit here?" Jake nodded, scooting over to make room. "Of course." As Mary sat down, she noticed Jake's hands. They were rough and calloused, but they shook slightly. She wondered why. Mary noticed a small photo peeking out of Jake's bag. "What's that?" she asked, pointing to it. Jake carefully pulled out the photo. It showed a younger version of himself with a little girl. "This is a picture of me and my daughter," he explained, his voice filled with a mix of love and sadness. Mary leaned in to look closer. "She's pretty. Where is she now?" Jake's shoulders slumped. "I don't know. I haven't seen her in a very long time." "Why are you sitting here all alone?" Mary asked, her voice full of innocent curiosity. Jake's smile faded a little. "Well, Mary, I don't really have anywhere else to go right now." Mary's brow furrowed in confusion. "You don't have a home?" Jake shook his head slowly. "No, not at the moment." Mary's heart felt heavy. She couldn't imagine not having a home. "That must be really hard. Please stay here. I will bring you something to eat," she said softly. Jake nodded, his eyes growing misty. Mary went back to her mother, her heart full of emotions she couldn't quite name. As she approached, she noticed her mom had packed up their picnic things. "Mom, can I give my sandwich to Jake?" Mary asked, pointing towards the bench. Brenda looked confused. "Jake? Who's Jake?" "The man on the bench," Mary explained. "He doesn't have a home, and I thought he might be hungry." Brenda's face softened. "That's very kind of you, sweetie. Okay, you can give him your sandwich, but I'll come with you." Mary beamed, grabbing her sandwich from their picnic basket. She led the way back to Jake's bench, her mom following close behind. "Hi, Jake," Mary said softly. "This is my mom. I brought you my sandwich." Jake's gaze moved from Mary to Brenda, and his expression changed. He looked sad, but there was something else too, a kind of longing that Mary didn't understand. "Thank you, Mary," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "That's very kind of you." Mary held out the sandwich and Jake took it with trembling hands. As he did, a tear slipped down his cheek. "Are you okay?" Mary asked, worried. Jake nodded, trying to smile. "Yes, I'm just..." Your kindness means a lot to me. Mary sat down next to Jake again, her mom standing nearby. You look sad, Mary observed. Is it because you miss your daughter? Mary, we need to go now, Brenda said, her voice tight. Mary looked up at her mom, surprised by the urgency in her tone. But Mom, we just got here. Can't we stay a little longer? Brenda shook her head firmly. No, we need to leave immediately. Mary frowned, confused by her mom's sudden change in mood. She turned back to Jake, who was looking at Brenda with a strange expression, like he was trying to figure something out. I'm sorry, Jake, I have to go, Mary said, standing up reluctantly. I hope you enjoy the sandwich. Jake nodded, his eyes still on Brenda. Thank you, Mary. You're a very special girl. As Mary stepped away from the bench, her mom grabbed her hand and started pulling her away quickly. Mom, why are we leaving so fast? Mary asked, stumbling a bit as she tried to keep up. Brenda didn't answer. She just kept walking, her grip on Mary's hand tight. Mary looked back over her shoulder at Jake. He was still sitting on the bench, watching them go. The sandwich lay untouched beside him, and tears were now flowing freely down his face. As they drove away from the park, Mary couldn't shake the strange feeling in her stomach. She kept thinking about Jake, his sad eyes, and the way her mom had rushed them away. The car felt different now, quieter, tenser. Mary looked over at her mom. Brenda's hands were gripping the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white. Mom, Mary said softly, are you okay? Brenda jumped a little as if she'd forgotten Mary was there. Of course, sweetie, I'm fine. But Mary could tell something wasn't right. Her mom's voice sounded different, higher and tighter than usual. Mom, did you know that man, Jake? She asked. Brenda's hands tightened on the wheel. What? No, of course not. Why would you think that? I don't know, Mary said slowly. You just seemed weird when we were talking to him. I wasn't weird, Brenda said quickly. I just didn't want you talking to strangers. It's not safe. Mary frowned. But you let me give him my sandwich. That was different, Brenda said, her voice sharp. Look, can we just drop it? It's nothing, okay? Mary nodded, but she didn't believe her mom. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like a blanket. Something was definitely off. The rest of the ride was quiet. Mary tried to think of other things, her friends at school, the book she was reading, but her mind kept going back to Jake. His sad eyes, the tears on his face, the way he'd looked at her mom. When they finally pulled into their driveway, Mary felt relief wash over her. She was glad to be home, away from the strange tension of the car ride. As they got out of the car, Mary noticed her mom's hands were shaking a little as she grabbed her purse. Mom, Mary said, are you sure everything's okay? Brenda plastered on a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. Everything's fine, sweetie. Let's just go inside, okay? I think we both need some rest after our day out. The rest of the day was seemingly ordinary, but Mary kept thinking about Jake, wondering if she should ask her mom. But Brenda seemed withdrawn, almost as if she didn't want to answer any questions. Feeling confused, Mary quietly went to bed, burdened with the feelings of confusion and curiosity. The next morning, Mary woke up to the sound of knocking at the front door. She rubbed her eyes and padded down the stairs, curious about who could be visiting so early. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw her mom already at the door, talking to someone. Mary's eyes widened when she realized it was a police officer. Mom, Mary called out, her voice small and uncertain. Brenda turned, her face pale. Mary, go back upstairs, please. But Mary didn't move. She was too curious and a little scared. The police officer noticed her and gave a gentle smile. Officer Brooks smiled. Nice to meet you, Mary. I need to talk to you and your mom about something important. Is that okay? Mary nodded, feeling both nervous and intrigued. Officer Brooks stood up and addressed them both. I'm here because of an incident that happened last night. The homeless man you met at the park yesterday, Jake. He's in jail. Mary gasped. What? Why? And what does that have to do with us, officer? Officer Brooks explained gently. He got into an altercation with some people in town. Nobody would want a homeless person living close to their property, so they reported him. You know how it is. When we questioned him, he gave us your address." Mary felt confused and a little scared. She looked up at her mom, expecting to see surprise, but instead, Brenda's face was white as a sheet. How did he know our address?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. Officer Brooks looked at Brenda, his expression serious. "That's what we're trying to figure out. Ma'am, do you know this man?" Brenda's hand tightened around Mary's. I don't." Officer Brooks studied Brenda's face carefully, his brow furrowing at her reaction. "Ma'am, are you sure you don't know this man? Your reaction seems unusual." "No, I've never met him before. We just happened to be at the park yesterday when Mary approached him." Mary looked up at her mom, confusion written all over her face. "But Mom, why did he know our address?" Brenda's voice trembled slightly as she answered, "I don't know, sweetie. Maybe he followed us home?" Officer Brooks raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a leap, ma'am. Did you notice anyone following you?" "No, I didn't," Brenda admitted, her eyes darting nervously. "But how else would he know where we live?" Mary piped up, "He seemed so sad, Mom. Maybe he just needed help." Brenda's face paled even more. "Mary, please, go to your room now. The adults need to talk." Reluctantly, Mary trudged up the stairs, glancing back at her mom and the police officer with worry in her eyes. Once Mary was out of earshot, Officer Brooks turned back to Brenda. "Ma'am, I have to say, your reaction to this situation is quite strange. Are you absolutely certain you've never encountered this man before?" Brenda straightened her back, trying to appear more composed. "Officer, I assure you, I have no connection to this homeless man. We're just a normal family who had an unfortunate encounter at the park. I'm simply concerned for our safety." Officer Brooks nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Brenda's face. "I understand your concern, ma'am, but if there's anything else you can tell us about this situation, it would be very helpful." "There's nothing else to tell," Brenda insisted, her voice growing firmer. "We don't know him, and we have no idea why he would give you our address." The police officer sighed, sensing that he wasn't going to get any more information at the moment. "All right, if you think of anything else, please don't hesitate to contact the station. We'll be looking into this matter further." As Officer Brooks turned to leave, Brenda called out, "Wait, is he going to be released soon?" The officer paused, giving her a curious look. "That depends on several factors." "Why do you ask?" Brenda fumbled for words. I'm just concerned about safety, that's all. If he knows where we live." Officer Brooks nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I understand. We'll keep you informed of any developments. In the meantime, make sure to lock your doors and windows, and call us if you notice anything suspicious." With that, Officer Brooks left, leaving Brenda standing in the doorway, her face a mix of relief and barely concealed anxiety. Officer Brooks returned to the police station, his mind churning with questions. The woman's strange behavior had set off alarm bells in his head. Something wasn't adding up. He made his way to the holding cells where the homeless man sat quietly, his eyes downcast. Officer Brooks pulled up a chair and settled in front of the cell. "Jake, I need to ask you some questions," he began gently. "You gave us an address when we brought you in. Can you tell me why?" The man looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a deep sadness. "That's my home," he said softly. "Or at least it used to be." Officer Brooks leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What do you mean? The woman there claims she doesn't know you." The man's face crumpled and he took a shaky breath. "Her name is Brenda. She's my wife." He paused, his voice breaking. "And the little girl, Mary, she's my daughter." Officer Brooks felt his eyebrows shoot up in surprise. "Hey, that's a serious claim. Can you explain further?" The man nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "My name is Jake. I used to be a successful businessman. Brenda and I, we had a good life. Mary was just a baby when..." He trailed off, his voice catching. "When what?" Officer Brooks prompted gently. Jake took a deep breath. When Brenda betrayed me, she forged my signature, took over my assets. Before I knew it, I'd lost everything. My business, my home, my family. Officer Brooks listened intently, his mind racing. And you've been on the street since then? Jake nodded. I tried to fight it, but without money for lawyers, I had nothing. As Jake sat behind the bars, his hands trembling slightly, Officer Brooks continued listening to his story. Jake hesitated for a moment, his voice faltering as he relieved painful memories. There's something I didn't mention earlier, officer, Jake said, swallowing hard. It wasn't just about the money or the business. Brenda, she left me because I was black. The words hung heavy in the air, and Officer Brooks looked at Jake with surprise. What do you mean? He asked, leaning forward. Jake exhaled deeply, staring at the cold, metallic bars in front of him. When we got married, things were different. We were young, in love. I thought race didn't matter to her, but over time, it started to eat at her. We faced judgment from her family, her friends. They always whispered behind our backs, calling her out for being with a black man. I didn't care, but she did. Officer Brooks frowned, trying to imagine the pressure that must have weighed on Jake. Brenda grew distant. Jake continued, his voice heavy with sorrow. She started resenting me, blaming me for things I couldn't control. She would say things like, "We wouldn't have these problems if you weren't black," or "I could have had a better life if I wasn't with you." It hurt, but I didn't fight back. I loved her. I loved our family. He rubbed his eyes with the back of his hand, his frustration evident. She wasn't just leaving me for money or power. She was leaving me because I wasn't good enough in her eyes. And when she found Terry, rich, white, and well-connected, it was like she saw her escape. Officer Brooks sat back, processing this information. It was a lot to take in, and if true, it painted a very different picture of the situation. He asked Jake to tell him everything in detail. Jake's shoulders slumped as he began his story, his voice heavy with pain. It all happened so fast, he said, his eyes distant. One day, I was on top of the world. The next, I had nothing. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. Brenda and we'd been married for 5 years when Mary was born. I thought we were happy. I was working hard, building my company from the ground up. It was starting to take off, and I was so excited about our future. Jake's hands trembled as he continued. I was working late one night when I got a call from my bank. They were asking about some unusual transactions. I rushed home, confused and worried. Officer Brooks leaned in, listening intently. When I got there, Brenda was gone. So was Mary. There was just a note on the kitchen table. Jake's voice cracked. It said she was leaving me, that she'd found someone else, someone who could give her the life she deserved. He paused, taking a shaky breath. I was devastated, but it got worse. The next day, I found out she'd forged my signature on a bunch of documents. She'd transferred ownership of my company to herself, emptied our bank accounts. She'd been planning this for months, maybe even years. Jake's eyes filled with tears. I tried to fight it. I went to lawyers, but without money, there wasn't much they could do. Brenda had covered her tracks well. She had help. Her lover, Terry, who was a hotshot lawyer, knew all the loopholes. Officer Brooks shook his head, disbelief etched on his face. That's terrible, Jake. I'm so sorry. Jake nodded, wiping his eyes. Before I knew it, I was out on the street. I lost my house, my car, everything. But the worst part was losing Mary. Brenda got full custody. The court believed her when she said I was unstable, that I'd physically tried to harm them. He looked up at Officer Brooks, his eyes pleading. I've never harmed my daughter or wife. What have you been doing all this time? Officer Brooks asked gently. Jake sighed. At first, I was just trying to survive. I slept in shelters when I could, on the streets when I couldn't. I picked up odd jobs here and there, but it was never enough. I fell into a deep depression. He straightened up a bit, a flicker of determination in his eyes. But I never gave up hope. I started saving every penny I could. I was determined to rebuild my life to clear my name. I wanted to be someone Mary could be proud of. Jake's voice softened. I've been working towards that goal for years now. It's been slow going, but I was making progress. I'd finally saved enough for an apartment, was about to start a new job, but then I lost all my money in a trading transaction and ran out of all my savings. My landlord evicted me, and I had to survive on scrubs. I was shocked to see Mary yesterday. She'd grown so much. He smiled sadly. She's grown so much. She looks just like her mother, but she has my eyes. When I saw Mary coming to me with Brenda, I almost broke down right there. I wanted so badly to tell her who I was, to hug her and never let go. Officer Brooks nodded sympathetically. Why didn't you? Jake shook his head. I was afraid Brenda would run, take Mary away before I could explain. I didn't want to scare Mary either. How do you tell a child that her whole life has been a lie? He looked down at his hands. I thought if I could just talk to Brenda, maybe she'd see how much I've changed. Maybe she'd let me be a part of Mary's life. That's why I gave your officers that address. I don't know what I hoped. Jake's voice trailed off, his story complete. The cell fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Officer Brooks sat back, processing everything he'd heard. It was a heartbreaking tale, one that painted a very different picture of the situation. If Jake was telling the truth, it meant that Brenda had committed serious crimes. It meant that a little girl had been denied her father for years. He looked at Jake, seeing not a homeless troublemaker, but a man who had been wronged in the worst way possible. Thank you for sharing your story, Jake, Officer Brooks said softly. I promise you, we're going to look into this. If what you're saying is true, we'll do everything we can to help you. In the evening, Officer Brooks sat in his patrol car, parked a block away from Mary's school. His mind raced with thoughts of Jake's story and the gravity of the situation. He knew he had to tread carefully, but he couldn't ignore the possibility that a grave injustice had been done. As the school bell rang, he watched students pour out of the building. His eyes scanned the crowd until he spotted Mary, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Taking a deep breath, he stepped out of his car and approached her. Mary? He called out gently. The girl turned, surprise flickering across her face as she recognized him. Officer Brooks? Is everything okay? He smiled reassuringly. Everything's fine. I was wondering if we could talk for a moment. It's important. Mary nodded, curiosity evident in her eyes. Officer Brooks led her to a nearby bench, away from the bustling crowd of students. Mary, what I'm about to tell you is very serious, he began, his voice low. I need you to promise me that you won't share this with your mom just yet. Can you do that? Mary's brow furrowed, but she nodded solemnly. I promise. Officer Brooks took a deep breath. Remember the man you met in the park? The one you gave your sandwich to? Mary's eyes widened. Yes, I remember him. Is he okay? He's fine, Officer Brooks assured her. But he told me something that I think you should know. He says, he's your father. Mary gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. My father? But Mom said, I know this is a lot to take in, Officer Brooks said gently. He told me a long story about what happened between him and your mom. It's complicated, and I'm still trying to figure out what's true. Mary's mind whirled with questions. But why didn't he tell me? Why hasn't he been around? Officer Brooks explained Jake's story as simply as he could, careful not to overwhelm her. He watched as emotions played across Mary's face, shock, confusion, and a hint of hope. When he finished, Mary sat quietly for a moment, processing everything she'd heard. Then she looked up at Officer Brooks, determination in her eyes. I want to talk to him, she said firmly. I want to hear his side of the story from him. Officer Brooks nodded, admiring her bravery. I understand, but remember, we need to be careful. Your mom doesn't know I'm telling you this, and we don't want to upset her until we know more. Mary nodded. I won't say anything to her, but please, can you arrange for me to meet him? Officer Brooks hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do. But Mary, this has to be our secret for now. Call my number whenever you are ready to visit him. Can you keep all this between us?" "I promise," Mary said solemnly. "Thank you for telling me, Officer Brooks." As they parted ways, Officer Brooks dropped Mary home. He knew he was taking a risk, but seeing the determination in Mary's eyes, he felt he had made the right choice. The truth was coming to light, and he hoped it would lead to healing for this fractured family. Mary went back home, her mind swirling with confusion. As she lay there, her eyes fell on a framed photo on her nightstand. It was a picture from last summer, with her mom and Terry at the beach. The differences between her and Terry were glaring. His pale skin, light hair, and sharp features were nothing like her own deep complexion and curls. She'd noticed it for as long as she could remember, but any time she'd brought it up, her mother always brushed her off. "Families come in all shapes and colors," Brenda would say, her tone firm, as if ending the conversation before it began. Mary had learned to drop it, though deep down something had always felt off. Memories began to flood back, each one casting Terry in a new light. She recalled how he always seemed more interested in his phone than in her school concerts, how he'd brush off her attempts to show him her artwork. Even on her birthdays, his gifts felt impersonal, like he'd grabbed whatever was on sale. "Has he ever actually hugged me?" Mary wondered aloud, her voice barely a whisper. She set the photo down and rolled onto her back, staring at the ceiling. All those times she'd tried to bond with Terry to win his approval came rushing back. His cold responses, his lack of interest in her life, it all suddenly made sense. Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. "If he's really my dad, why doesn't he love me?" she asked the empty room. The homeless man's face flashed in her mind. She remembered the look in his eyes when he saw her, that mix of sadness and longing. It was so different from the indifference she usually saw in Terry's eyes. Mary sat up, wiping her eyes. She felt a strange mix of sadness and hope stirring in her heart. Could it be true? Could that man really be her father? She walked to her desk and pulled out her journal. With shaky hands, she began to write down everything she could remember about Terry's behavior towards her. As the list grew longer, a clearer picture started to form. Jake had told her he was her real dad, but how could she be sure? Her mother had lied to her before. What if this was another twisted game? But there was one way to find out. She could get the proof she needed, no more guessing, no more wondering. The answer was right in front of her, a DNA test. Her eyes darted to the bathroom. Terry's hairbrush sat on the counter, a simple tool he used every morning without a second thought. She stood up, her heart pounding with the weight of what she was about to do. She crept quietly into the bathroom, her movements slow and deliberate. The house was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Terry and her mom were out, thankfully, giving her just enough time to do what needed to be done. Mary's hands trembled as she reached for the brush, staring at the strands of hair tangled in the bristles. This was it, the truth. Carefully, she plucked a few hairs from the brush, making sure they had the roots intact. She slipped them into a small plastic bag and sealed it. Sadly, Mary had no idea where to get a DNA test done, but the thought of finding the truth about her father burned in her mind. After scrolling through endless pages, she finally found what she was looking for, a website offering mail-in DNA tests. The process was simple, but there was one major problem. She didn't have a credit card. She bit her lip, eyes darting to the clock on her computer. Brenda was at work, and Terry wouldn't be home for another couple of hours. Mary had used her mother's account to order things before, but this was different. This time, she wasn't buying school supplies or clothes. This was about finding the truth. Her palms were sweaty as she opened her mother's email, pretending to be her. She entered the information into the DNA testing website, her heart racing as she carefully typed the shipping address. The final step, the credit card number. She hesitated, fingers trembling, before finally entering Brenda's card details. It was done. She clicked Submit Order, and a confirmation screen popped up. Mary sat back in her chair, adrenaline surging through her veins. She'd done it. The test was on its way. Now, All she had to do was wait. The days that followed were filled with anxious anticipation. Every time the doorbell rang, her stomach flipped, wondering if it was the DNA kit arriving. Each day after school, she rushed home, checking the mailbox before anyone else could see it. Finally, after what felt like forever, the small package arrived. Mary spotted it sitting innocently on the front porch as she came home from school. She grabbed it, slipping it into her backpack before heading inside. Her nerves buzzed as she climbed the stairs to her room, eager to get the test done. Just as she was about to shut her bedroom door, she heard a voice from behind. "Hey, what's that?" Terry's voice made her freeze in place. Mary's heart skipped a beat. She turned slowly, clutching the small box in her hands. Terry stood at the bottom of the stairs, eyeing the package suspiciously. It's just some school supplies," she said, her voice too quick, too rehearsed. Her heart thudded in her chest. Terry frowned, stepping closer. His eyes narrowed as he studied her, and for a moment, Mary thought she was caught. She could feel the weight of the package in her hands, and her palms began to sweat. Before he could ask any more questions, Terry's phone rang. He looked down at the buzzing device in his pocket, annoyance flashing across his face. He hesitated for a second longer before he turned away, answering the call. Mary exhaled a shaky breath, her pulse racing. She didn't wait for Terry to finish his conversation. She darted into her room, closing the door softly behind her. Her hands were trembling as she dropped her backpack on the floor and carefully pulled out the package. That was too close. Her fingers tore open the box with quiet urgency, revealing the DNA kit inside. She followed the instructions quickly, gathering the hair samples she had plucked from Terry's brush and sealing them into the provided containers. After packing everything up neatly, Mary slipped the sample back into the package. She sealed it and stuffed it deep into her backpack, planning to mail it off the next day after school. The sooner she got it out of the house, the better. That night, Mary lay awake in bed, her mind racing. Terry had almost caught her, and the thought of what could have happened made her stomach churn. What would she have said if he'd insisted on seeing the package? What if her mother had come home earlier and opened it herself? But now it didn't matter. The kit was ready to go, and she was one step closer to the truth. The next afternoon, as soon as school let out, Mary rushed to the nearest post office. She slid the package across the counter, watching as the clerk stamped it and sent it on its way. The moment the box disappeared from her sight, a flood of relief washed over her. The next few days were a blur. Every time she saw Terry or her mother, she felt a surge of guilt. But she couldn't shake the urgency to find out. If Terry wasn't her real father, everything would change. Finally, the day came when the results arrived. The email notification pinged on her phone, sending a jolt of adrenaline through her. Mary sat frozen, staring at the screen. Her hands shook as she opened the email, the lines of text swimming in front of her eyes. She scrolled down, her breath catching in her throat. Paternity. Excluded. The word hit her like a punch to the gut. Mary's heart raced as she realized the truth that had been right in front of her all along. Terry had never acted like a real father, because he wasn't. Next morning, Mary's heart pounded as she dialed Officer Brooks's number. Her hands shook, but she knew she had to do this. When he answered, she spoke in a hushed voice. "Officer Brooks, it's Mary. I need to see him, the man in jail. Can you help me?" There was a pause on the other end. "Are you sure, Mary? This is a big step." "I'm sure," she said, her voice steadier now. "I need to know the truth." Officer Brooks agreed to help. They planned for him to pick her up after school the next day, telling her mother she was staying late for a study group. That night, Mary barely slept. She tossed and turned, imagining what it would be like to meet the man who might be her real father. When morning came, she felt exhausted but determined. At school, Mary could hardly focus on her lessons. The clock seemed to crawl, each tick echoing her nervous heartbeat. When the final bell rang, she rushed out to find Officer Brooks waiting in his patrol car. "Ready?" he asked gently as she climbed in. Mary nodded, clutching her backpack tightly. "I think so." After Jake had been arrested, the police discovered he had a criminal record from years ago, a minor theft charge from when he'd been struggling on the streets. This old charge complicated his release, as the system flagged him as a repeat offender. Despite the new charges being minor, Jake found himself caught in the bureaucratic web for some more time. As they drove to the jail, Officer Brooks explained what to expect. He's in a special visiting area. There'll be a glass partition between you, but you can talk through a phone. Mary listened, trying to calm her nerves. She stared out the window, watching the familiar streets of her town give way to an area she'd never seen before. When they arrived at the jail, Mary's legs felt wobbly as she followed Officer Brooks inside. The building was gray and imposing, nothing like she'd imagined. They went through security, and then Officer Brooks led her to a small room with chairs facing a glass wall. "Wait here," he said kindly. "I'll go get him." Mary sat down, her heart racing. She wiped her sweaty palms on her jeans, taking deep breaths to steady herself. A few minutes later, the door on the other side of the glass opened. The man she'd met in the park walked in looking nervous but hopeful. His eyes lit up when he saw her, and Mary felt a strange tug in her chest. He sat down across from her and picked up the phone on his side. Mary did the same. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mary studied his face, searching for any resemblance to her own. His eyes were kind, just like she remembered. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "Hello, Mary," he said softly. I'm so glad you came." Mary took a deep breath. "Are you really my dad?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake nodded, tears forming in his eyes. "Yes, I am. I know this must be so confusing for you, but I promise I'll explain everything." Mary felt tears welling up in her own eyes. She had so many questions, so many conflicting emotions. But as she looked at Jake, she felt a sense of connection she'd never experienced before. Mary leaned closer to the glass, her eyes fixed on Jake's face. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "Tell me everything." Jake took a deep breath, his eyes brimming with tears. "I've waited so long for this moment," he began. "Mary, I know it's hard to believe, but I am your father. Your mother and I were married for 5 years before you were born." Mary listened intently, her heart racing as Jake continued his story. "The day you were born was the happiest day of my life," Jake said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You were so tiny. I held you in my arms, and you wrapped your little hand around my finger." Tears streamed down Mary's cheeks as she pictured the scene. Jake went on, describing her first steps, her first words, and the way she used to giggle when he tickled her tummy. "Your favorite bedtime story was Goodnight Moon," Jake said, smiling at the memory. "You'd point at the pictures and say moon over and over. We read it every night until you fell asleep." Mary gasped softly. She still had that book tucked away in her closet. Her mother had told her it was a gift from a relative. Jake's expression darkened as he continued. "Things were good for a while, but then your mother met someone else. She changed. One day I came home to find the locks changed and all my things on the front lawn." He explained how Brenda had tricked him into signing papers while also forging his signatures. "I tried to fight it, but without money for lawyers, I couldn't do anything. I lost everything. My home, my business, and worst of all, you." Mary's mind reeled as she tried to process everything. It all sounded so unbelievable, and yet, it was true. "I never stopped thinking about you, Mary," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been trying to get back on my feet, to find a way to see you again. When I saw you in the park that day, I couldn't believe my eyes. You've grown so much, but I'd recognize you anywhere." As Mary listened to Jake's story, she felt a mix of emotions: anger at her mother's deception, sadness for the years lost with her father, and a growing sense of connection to the man before her. "I know this is a lot to take in," Jake said gently. "But I want you to know that I love you, Mary. I always have, and I always will. No matter what happens, you're my daughter, and nothing can change that." Mary nodded, tears flowing freely now. Mary wiped her tears and looked at Jake with newfound determination. "I believe you, Dad," she said, her voice growing stronger. "I want to help you. What can we do?" Jake's eyes lit up with hope. "Thank you, Mary. That means everything to me." He leaned closer to the glass. "First, we need to get me out of here. Do you think you could talk to Officer Brooks about the DNA test results? Mary nodded eagerly. I'll talk to him right away. He seemed to believe your story. Maybe he can help us now that we have proof. That's a good start, Jake said. Once I'm out, we need to gather evidence of your mother's fraud. There might be some old documents at the house that could help prove what she did. Mary's brow furrowed as she thought, I think I know where Mom keeps important papers. I'll look for anything that might help. Jake smiled proudly at his daughter's quick thinking. Be careful, Mary. We don't want your mother to suspect anything yet. As they continued planning, Mary felt a mix of excitement and nervousness. She was scared of confronting her mother, but knew it was the right thing to do. Mary, Jake said softly, I know this is hard for you. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. Your safety and well-being come first. Mary shook her head. No, Dad, I want to help. You've been treated unfairly and I want to make it right. Jake's eyes welled up with tears again. You're so brave, just like I remember. We'll get through this together. As their visit came to an end, Mary promised to return soon. She left the jail with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to take on the challenge ahead. Over the next few days, Mary worked tirelessly to help her father. She spoke with Officer Brooks and began secretly searching her house for any documents that might prove her mother's fraud. One afternoon, while her mother was out, Mary found a hidden box in the back of her mother's closet. Inside were old papers and photos. Her hands shook as she sifted through them, finding what looked like copies of forged signatures on many bank statements and documents. Mary carefully took photos of the documents with her phone, making sure to leave everything exactly as she found it. She couldn't wait to show her father what she'd discovered. During her next visit to the jail, Mary excitedly shared her findings with Jake. Dad, look at these, she whispered, showing him the photos on her phone. I think these might help prove what Mom did. Jake's eyes widened as he looked at the images. Mary, this is incredible. These documents could be the key to proving the fraud. You've done an amazing job. One afternoon, as they sat talking, Officer Brooks appeared with a smile on his face. Good news, Jake, he said. Your bail's been posted. You will be free to go tomorrow. Mary's heart leaped with joy. Thank you, Mary, Jake whispered, for believing in me and for everything you've done. Mary then shared all his findings with Officer Brooks, but Jake told him not to take any immediate action. He wanted to confront Brenda along with Mary before taking any rash decisions. That afternoon, Mary's heart pounded as she stepped into her house. She knew what she had to do, but that didn't make it any easier. With shaky hands, she pulled out her phone and opened the voice recorder app. She hit the record button and slipped the device into her pocket, making sure the microphone was unobstructed. Taking a deep breath, Mary squared her shoulders and walked towards her mom and Terry's room. She could hear their muffled voices through the door. For a moment, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. But then she thought of her real dad, Jake, and how much he had suffered. That gave her the courage she needed. Mary pushed the door open without knocking. Brenda and Terry looked up, startled by her sudden entrance. Mary! Brenda exclaimed. What's wrong, sweetie? Mary's voice came out stronger than she expected. Mom, I need to talk to you. Alone. Terry frowned, his face turning red. Now listen here, young lady. You can't just barge in here and start making demands. Show some respect. I'm your father, after all. Something snapped inside Mary. All the lies, all the years of deception came rushing to the surface. She couldn't hold back anymore. You're not my father, she shouted, her voice echoing in the suddenly silent room. I know the truth now. I know everything. The color drained from Brenda's face. Terry's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, no words coming out. Mary, Brenda started, her voice trembling. What are you talking about? But Mary's eyes were fixed on Terry. Get out, she said, her voice low and firm. I need to talk to my mom alone. Terry looked from Mary to Brenda, confusion and anger battling on his face. Brenda, what's going on here? He demanded. Brenda couldn't meet his eyes. Terry, please, she whispered. Just go. With a final glare at Mary, Terry stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Mary stood there, her heart racing as she faced her mother. Brenda looked small and scared, nothing like the confident woman Mary had always known. "Mom," Mary said, her voice softening slightly. "I know about Dad. My real dad. Jake." Brenda's eyes widened in shock. How did you find out?" Mary took a deep breath, preparing herself for the conversation that would change everything. "That doesn't matter right now," she said. "What matters is that I know the truth." Brenda's face crumpled, tears welling up in her eyes. She reached out to Mary, but the girl stepped back, keeping her distance. "Oh, sweetie," Brenda said, her voice trembling. "You don't understand. It's not what you think." Mary crossed her arms, her jaw set. "Then explain it to me, Mom. Tell me why you lied about my real dad all these years." Brenda's demeanor suddenly shifted. Her eyes hardened and she straightened up, wiping away her tears. "You want the truth? Fine. Yes, I took your father's money and his company, but you have no idea what our life was like before that." "What are you talking about?" Mary asked, taken aback by her mother's sudden change. Brenda sighed, her tone growing more defensive. "You don't know what it was like, Mary. Being married to Jake was difficult. He was black. It wasn't just about love. We faced judgment, constant whispers. My family, my friends, they all looked down on us. People thought I was crazy for being with him." Mary stepped back, stunned by her mother's words. "So you left him because he was black?" Mary's voice wavered, filled with disbelief. Brenda's face hardened. "It wasn't just that, Mary. It was everything. I wanted more, and Terry could give me that. He was successful. He was respected. He didn't bring complications. I did what I had to do to give you a better life." Mary shook her head in disbelief. "By stealing from Dad and leaving him homeless?" "No, I didn't know he'd end up homeless," Brenda said defensively. "And it wasn't stealing. I built that company as much as he did. I deserved my share." "Your share?" Mary's voice rose. "You took everything from him." Brenda's eyes flashed. "I did it for you, Mary. Everything I've done has been for you. Do you think I enjoyed lying? Do you think it was easy keeping up this charade all these years?" "Don't you dare put this on me," Mary shouted, her fists clenched at her sides. "You didn't do this for me, you did it for yourself." "How can you say that?" Brenda's voice turned pleading. "Look around you, Mary. This house, your clothes, your education, all of it came from what I did. I gave you the life your father never could." Mary felt her anger rising. "A life built on lies and theft? That's not what I wanted, Mom. I would have been happy with less if it meant having a real family." Brenda's face hardened again. "You're too young to understand. The world isn't black and white, Mary. Sometimes we have to make hard choices for the greater good." "The greater good?" Mary scoffed. "How is destroying Dad's life for the greater good?" "I protected you from his failures," Brenda shouted, losing her composure. "I made sure you'd have opportunities he could never give you. Everything I did for you." Mary felt a surge of fury at her mother's words. "Stop saying that. You didn't do this for me. You did it because you're selfish and greedy. You wanted the money and the power for yourself." Mary then stormed into her room and sent the entire conversation to Officer Brooks, which she had recorded using her phone. Officer Brooks assured her that they already had all the evidence that they needed, and once Jake gets bail tomorrow, he can decide what to do. As night fell, tension filled the air in Brenda's house. Terry paced the living room, his face twisted with frustration. Brenda sat on the couch, her eyes red from crying. "I'm done with this charade, Brenda," Terry growled. "I'm sick of pretending to be that girl's father." Brenda looked up, shocked. "What are you saying, Terry?" "I'm saying it's time we leave this mess behind," he said, his voice cold. "Let's pack up and move to another city. Start fresh." Brenda stood up, her hands shaking. "Leave Mary? I can't do that, Terry. She's my daughter." Terry scoffed. "Your daughter? The one who just found out about your lies? Face it, Brenda, it's over." "No!" Brenda shouted, surprising herself with her intensity. "I won't abandon her. I love her, Terry." Terry's face darkened. More than you love me? After everything we've been through? Brenda hesitated, torn between her love for her daughter and her fear of losing Terry. I can't choose, Terry. Please don't make me. Terry grabbed his jacket, heading for the door. I need some time alone. I'm leaving town for a week. Figure out what you want, Brenda. As the door slammed behind Terry, Brenda collapsed onto the couch. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of her actions crashed down on her. She had torn her family apart with her greed, and now she was losing Terry too. In the quiet of the house, Brenda felt a deep, aching sadness. She thought about Mary, probably crying in her room, and Jake, sitting in a jail cell. She thought about Terry, driving away in anger. Her perfect life, built on lies and deceit, was crumbling around her. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the windows as Mary paced nervously in the living room. Her heart raced with anticipation and fear. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, making her jump. Mary took a deep breath and opened the door. There stood Jake, her father, looking tired but hopeful. Officer Brooks stood beside him, a reassuring presence. "Hi, Mary," Jake said softly, his eyes filled with emotion. Before Mary could respond, Brenda appeared behind her, her face pale with shock. "What's going on here?" she demanded. Officer Brooks stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need to talk. It's important." Jake entered the house, his eyes never leaving Mary's face. The girl felt a mix of emotions, relief, confusion, and a hint of joy at seeing her father free. "Mary, sweetie," Brenda said, her voice trembling. "What's happening?" Jake took a deep breath and turned to face Brenda. "It's over, Brenda. I have all the proof of what you did." Brenda's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? What proof? What are you talking about?" Jake pulled out a folder from his bag. "These documents show how you forged my signature to take over the company. How you manipulated accounts to make it look like I had embezzled money." Brenda's face was drained of color. She stumbled back, gripping the wall for support. "That's impossible. How did you get those?" Jake looked at Mary, a proud smile on his face. "Our daughter. She found the documents and shared them with Officer Brooks." Brenda's head snapped towards Mary, her eyes blazing with anger and betrayal. "You did what?" she hissed. Mary flinched but stood her ground. "I had to know the truth, Mom. I couldn't live with the lies anymore." Brenda's face contorted with rage. "How dare you?" she screamed. "After everything I've done for you, I gave you a good life, a comfortable home, and this is how you repay me?" Officer Brooks stepped between them. "Ma'am, please calm down. We need to discuss this rationally." But Brenda was beyond reason. She lunged at Mary, her hands outstretched. "You ungrateful little—" Jake quickly pulled Mary out of harm's way, shielding her with his body. Officer Brooks restrained Brenda, who was now sobbing uncontrollably. "I did it all for you, Mary," Brenda cried. "Everything was for you. How could you betray me like this?" Mary felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Mom, you lied to me my whole life. You took Dad away from me. How is that for my good?" Jake put a comforting arm around Mary's shoulders. "It's okay, sweetheart. You did the right thing." Officer Brooks, still holding on to Brenda, spoke up. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you'll need to come with me to the station. We have some serious matters to discuss." As Officer Brooks led a distraught Brenda out of the house, Jake turned to Mary. "I'm so proud of you, Mary. You were so brave." Before leaving, Brenda turned to Jake, her eyes desperate. "Jake, please, I'll leave Terry. We can be a family again. I'll sign everything back over to you. Just, please give me another chance." Jake and Mary exchanged a look, both clearly skeptical of Brenda's sudden change of heart. "How can we trust you?" Jake asked, his voice low and controlled. "After everything you've done?" Brenda stood up, her hands outstretched. "I'll prove it to you. I'll do whatever it takes. I love you both so much. Please, let's start over." But as she spoke, Mary noticed something in her mother's eyes, a flicker of calculation that didn't match her tearful words. It was the same look she'd seen when her mother lied about not knowing Jake at the park. Jake took a deep breath, his eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. He looked at Brenda, the woman he had once loved, and shook his head slowly. "I'm sorry, Brenda," he said, his voice firm but tinged with regret. "But I can't forgive you. Not after everything you've put me through." Brenda's face fell, her hopeful expression crumbling. "But Jake, I said I'd make it right. We can start over." Jake held up his hand, stopping her. "No, we can't. The years I spent on the streets cold and alone while you lived in luxury with our daughter, that's not something I can just forget." Mary stood by her father's side, her small hand slipping into his. Jake squeezed it gently, drawing strength from her presence. "Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your child grow up from afar?" Jake's voice cracked with emotion. "To see her playing in the park and not be able to hug her or tell her how much I love her." Brenda's eyes filled with tears, but Jake pressed on. "Your greed tore our family apart. You chose money and power over love and honesty. That's not something we can come back from." He took a step forward, his stance resolute. "I'm moving back into this house with Mary. It's time for us to be a real family again." Brenda's eyes widened in shock. "But where will I go? What about Terry?" Jake's expression hardened. "That's not my concern anymore. You made your choice when you forged my signature and kicked me out. Now you and Terry can figure out your own living arrangements." Mary looked up at her father, a mix of relief and sadness in her eyes. "Are you sure about this, Dad?" Jake knelt down to Mary's level, his eyes softening as he looked at his daughter. "I'm sure, sweetheart. It's time for us to heal and start over. Just you and me." As the reality of the situation sinks in, Mary watched her mother's face crumple. Brenda's anger melted away, replaced by a look of utter despair. The woman who had once seemed so strong and in control now seemed so small and broken. "Mom," Mary whispered, her voice cracking. Jake, Mary's father, places a hand on her shoulder. "It's for the best, sweetie. She made her choices." "Wait," Mary cried out, her voice trembling. "Dad, we can't just let her go like this." Jake looks at his daughter, surprise etched on his face. "Mary, after everything she's done—" "I know," Mary interrupts, wiping at her eyes. "I know what she did was wrong. But she's still my mom." Brenda paused at the door, turning back with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. Mary took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm so angry at you, Mom. You lied to me. You hurt Dad. But I can't bear the thought of you having nothing." Jake's expression softened as he watched his daughter struggle with her emotions. He kneels down beside her, gently squeezing her hand. "You have a big heart, kiddo. What do you think we should do?" Mary looked, mind racing. Maybe we could help her find a place to stay, just until she can get back on her feet?" Brenda's eyes fill with tears. "Oh, Mary, I don't deserve your kindness." Mary sniffles, looking up at her father with gratitude. "Thank you, Dad." Jake nods, then turns to Brenda. "We'll help you find a small apartment, and I will not be pressing any charges. As much as I hate you for what you did, I don't want our daughter to live without a mother." Brenda nods quickly, a mix of relief and shame on her face. "I understand, thank you both. I'm so sorry for everything." As the adults discussed the details, Mary retreated to the living room, collapsing onto the couch. The emotions of the day washed over her, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. A few minutes later, she felt the couch dip beside her. Looking up, she saw her father, his eyes filled with concern. "You okay, sweetheart?" Jake asked softly. Mary shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "I don't know, Dad. I'm so confused. I'm angry at Mom, but I still love her. Is that wrong?" Jake pulled her into a gentle hug. "No, honey, it's not wrong at all. Love is complicated. Your mom did some terrible things, but that doesn't erase all the good memories you have with her." Mary leaned into her father's embrace, drawing comfort from his presence. I just wish things could go back to the way they were before." "I know," Jake says, stroking her hair, "but sometimes life doesn't work out the way we want it to. What's important is how we handle the challenges that come our way." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of recent events hanging heavy in the air. Then Mary spoke up, her voice small. "Dad, what's going to happen now?" Jake took a deep breath. "Well, it's going to take some time to sort everything out, but you and I were going to be okay. We'll figure this out together." Mary nods, wiping away the last of her tears. "I'm glad you're back, Dad. I missed you, even when I didn't know I was missing you." Jake's eyes grew misty. "I missed you too, kiddo, more than you could ever know." As they sat together, the sound of Brenda's footsteps approached. She stood in the doorway, looking uncertain. I'm heading out now," she said softly. "Mary, I know I've hurt you terribly. I hope that someday you can forgive me." Mary looked at her mother, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside her. She didn't know what to say, so she simply nodded. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of change for Mary. She watched as her mother, Brenda, packed her belongings and moved out of the family home. It was a bittersweet moment, filled with conflicting emotions. "Do you need any help, Mom?" Mary asked hesitantly, standing in the doorway of her mother's bedroom. Brenda looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "No, sweetie, I've got it under control, but thank you for asking." As Brenda zipped up her last suitcase, she turned to Mary with a sad smile. "I know I've made terrible mistakes, honey, but I want you to know that I love you, and I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused." Mary nodded, her throat tight with unshed tears. "I love you too, Mom, even though things are different now." After Brenda left, Mary and her father, Jake, began the process of rebuilding their lives together. It was strange at first. Living with a man she had only recently discovered was her real father. But as the days passed, they found a comfortable rhythm. One evening, as they sat on the porch swing, Jake turned to Mary. "How are you holding up, kiddo?" Mary sighed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "It's hard, Dad, but I'm glad you're here." Jake wrapped an arm around her. "Me too, sweetheart. We'll figure this out together." Despite the pain of recent events, Mary found herself growing closer to Jake. They spent evenings talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other. Jake told her about her first steps, her favorite lullaby as a baby, and the day she said her first word. "You wouldn't believe it, but your first word was cookie," Jake chuckled. "You had such a sweet tooth even then." Mary laughed, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. These were the moments she had always craved, a genuine connection with a parent who truly cared. As the weeks went by, Mary settled into a new routine. She went to school, hung out with friends, and spent quality time with Jake. But she also made an effort to maintain a relationship with her mother. Every Saturday, Mary would visit Brenda at her new apartment. It was awkward at first, with tension hanging thick in the air. But slowly, they began to rebuild their bond. "I made your favorite cookies," Brenda said one afternoon, offering Mary a plate of chocolate chip treats. Mary took one, savoring the familiar taste. "Thanks, Mom, they're just like I remember." They sat together on Brenda's small balcony, talking about Mary's week at school and Brenda's new job. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Back at home with Jake, Mary found herself smiling more often. They cooked dinner together, watched movies, and even started a small garden in the backyard. "Look, Dad," Mary exclaimed one day, pointing to a tiny green sprout. "Our tomato plant is growing." Jake beamed with pride. "Just like you, sweetheart. Growing stronger every day." As the months passed, Mary's life settled into a new normal. She lived happily with Jake, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. They created new traditions, like Sunday morning pancakes and evening walks in the park. Mary still visited Brenda regularly, working on forgiveness and rebuilding trust. It wasn't always easy, but Mary knew that having both parents in her life, even in different capacities, was important. One night, as Mary got ready for bed, she paused to look at a new family photo on her nightstand. It showed her and Jake, arms around each other, laughing at the camera. Next to it was a smaller photo of her and Brenda from a recent outing. Mary smiled, touching both pictures gently. Her family might not be traditional, but it was hers. And despite the pain and challenges they had faced, she felt a sense of peace settling over her. As she drifted off to sleep, Mary felt grateful for the love and support surrounding her. She knew that with her father by her side and her mother still in her life, she could face whatever the future held. Her family, though broken, had found a way to heal and move forward together. If you enjoyed the story of Mary, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.